I think we've always been talking about production within the context of tons. So 1 ton per quarter gives us 4 tons per year. And what you see there now is that with a 33% rise, both as a consequence of Ergo performing really well over the 6 months, considering just the number of issues that we had to deal with, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on, that we actually achieved production of 3 tons for the 6 months. That resonated in the numbers. You could see that there's an operating profit that's increased by 604% to just under R750 million, and all-in sustaining margin up from less than 1% to 26.7%. This translated into healthy headline earnings, just under R250 million. And Riaan will obviously expand a little bit more on those numbers. And as a consequence, we're also in a position now to, after 6 months, declare a dividend of 25 cents per share. And this will be the 13th consecutive year where our company has been in a position to distribute free cash and pay out a dividend. We will reflect a little bit just on how we arrived at this dividend. You'll see that we made mention in our letter to shareholders and the pack on our thinking in this regard. Obviously, our philosophy has always been that we don't sit on free cash. We distribute free cash, and typically what we would do is look at near-term capital commitments. We also like to retain a buffer, and then the balance goes out to shareholders. And then for good reason. A very large percentage of our shareholders are here in the United States, and us being an emerging economy, obviously we have a somewhat vulnerable, or at least volatile, currency. Maybe not as vulnerable as we thought it was, but certainly volatile. And we don't want to be sitting on an asset that's diminishing in value. We'd rather give the cash to shareholders, and then they can apply it in whichever way they deem fit, and we'll look after the business. However, a big chunk of the free cash that came into the business this year came from the Far West operations. And you'll know that we've been talking about the first phase and the second phase of the Far West operations now, right from its inception. And the second phase will involve a slightly different blend compared to what we've got now. At the moment, we are mining a fairly high-grade resource. It needs to be applied within the context of the larger ore body, and it's not happening at the moment. It's very much in accordance with plan. We are in the first phase. We're establishing project track record at this stage and looking at the parameters of what this thing's going to look like as and when we implement. But you do have to apply the proceeds also within the context of the entire resource. And to take all of the, let's call it almost the windfall portion of the operating profits that are being generated by this circuit now, and just distribute all of that and not apply it back into the bigger project, I think would be maybe to not use it 100% in accordance with our approach, with our policy or our value system, if you want to call it that. So some of that money is being retained, and Riaan could perhaps elaborate more a little bit on how we arrived at that. It's really the difference in the assumed gold price and what we're actually seeing, and that's going to go back into the project. So it's maybe not as big a chunk of free cash as we did in the past, although we did reduce the buffer somewhat, the cash buffer somewhat, but it's for very good reason. There was some thinking that actually went into that. And this was the first full 6-month period where we had full production from the Far West gold operations. So just on the sustainable development side, these are slides that 6-7 years ago almost went unnoticed, I think, to a large extent. But with the introduction of ESG, or the emphasis on ESG, which is, I think, a development from sustainable development, or the new theme around sustainable development, and the emphasis on that in the investor market, I think we do have some history that we can talk to, and the work that we've done in this regard stand us in good stead in terms of developing our ESG narrative. So maybe I'll start spending a little bit more time on this again, as I did several years ago, now that the market actually takes this stuff seriously, and it's being used as a qualifier in many funds before investment in a company is allowed. Now, we do set very specific targets in terms of both the containment of our operations on the environment, our installations on the environment, and also what needs to be left after we've mined. And looking at the impact of our mining operations in the broader scheme of things, I think there are four, one could argue maybe five distinct parallel initiatives in this regard. The one is the containment of environmental impact. And this is really, what do we do about dust? Our mines are in the middle of Johannesburg. And remember, the mine didn't go to the city came to the mine. And as a consequence, you would find that there are lots of communities that had sprung up around our installations, and typically around the tailings dams as well. And their lives can be an absolute misery if the potential impact, environmental impact of those installations aren't looked after. So a small fortune has been spent, not a small fortune, in fact, a big fortune has been spent over the last 10, maybe 12 years on containing the impact of particularly the permanent storage facilities, the tailings dams that we have. So ongoing vegetation as a measure to contain dust and ensure that we don't cover those surrounding communities in a cloud of dust with both the nuisance and the health impacts that it potentially have. That's been a very important part. It's been a big priority for our company. And obviously, if you're dealing with a legacy that is more than 100 years old, you don't do it all at once. But I think what we are seeing now is 10 years of dedicated work in that regard, of consistently making sure that the area that's covered by vegetation every year increases, improves, that we reverse the impact of maybe some unthinking behavior in burning down some of the vegetation that we establish. You can see the little picture there in the left-hand corner with the irrigation. It needs irrigation for 2, sometimes up to 3 years before it's independently established. So fires on these tailings dams do cost us a lot of money, and I can't imagine why people would think it's a good idea to burn them down, but be that as it may. But we're winning that battle, and we're seeing that the dust emissions, and this 0.71% dust emissions exceedances, what this basically means is that of all the measurements that we take, and there are several thousand measurements that are taken every year in dust buckets in and around all of these areas. I think there are in excess of 290, there are about 90 sites where we do measure dust in different areas surrounding the mines. Less than 1% of those measurements that were taken through the entire year exceeded the statutory limit on airborne particles. So it's a race that we are winning. It's not over yet. We'll probably only finish in about 2022, 2023 with the vegetation of all of these tailings dams. But it's well worth doing, because I think it profoundly impacts the quality of life of people living in and around those areas. So that's the first thing that we do, the first dynamic in terms of environmental containment. The second one, obviously, is the rehabilitation of sites that were previously sterilized. When mining started in Johannesburg, it was open felt. So mine dumps were established, and their deposition sites were established in areas that were convenient, lower-lying areas. So what we find is that lots and lots of areas are affected, low-lying areas, wetlands, flay areas, and so forth, by unthinking deposition techniques and policies dating back 80, 90 years ago. This is now slowly but surely being reversed. It's being restored. Around the Crown plant, for example, you'll see that there's a huge area where the riverbed has been cleaned up. It's resuming its natural flow path. And we envisage more of those going forward. There is one area in particular, not far from the Rivoli community, which is one of our future priorities when it comes to quality of life and so forth. And everybody in our operations know that this is an important priority for both the board and for the executive, that this is addressed. There's a flay area there too, where whatever the financial upside turns out to be is maybe of lesser importance, not of no importance, but of lesser importance in deciding whether or not we're going to be doing it, because this too is a catchment area where sediments have been accumulating for several decades. We're the only company in South Africa, in Johannesburg, with the infrastructure capacity and the will to actually want to lift this, clean it up, and do it in such a way that it's not costing the shareholders money. We can, at the very least, do it in a cost-neutral fashion, and we might actually even turn a small profit. But it will be the cleanup of an area that ultimately, in 5, 6, 7, 8 years from now, when it's been cleaned up, will be restored to the pristine condition that it was in before contamination started taking place, before sediment started accumulating there. So this is the reversal of the environmental legacy aspect, cleaning up sensitive sites. The third one, obviously, is the fact that a lot of the sites that are being cleaned, and we're talking about several hundred hectares. I think last year alone was 135 hectares of land that had been restored. Not all the mine dumps, thankfully, had been built in wetlands and flays. Some of them have been built in areas that are perfectly suitable for development, industrial and even residential development. So more and more of that is taking place as well. The landscape, Johannesburg, is changing. These dumps are being moved. Deposition after recycling takes place on a modern dam that is managed to modern standards, increasingly transparent sharing of information and so forth and so forth. That's being required of mining companies increasingly. That's on the governance side, and we're perfectly comfortable with that. We have those structures in place, and we're developing those. But that's the third thing, is the development of these sites for purposes of either residential or for industrial sites. And that is how I think the activities of our company, which has a commercial focus, has the added benefit of reversing something that had happened over many, many years in terms of environmental cleanup. So there you can see 31 hectares of additional deposition area that's been vegetated, and the difference between the dust coming off these dams now compared to what they looked like 10 years ago is chalk and cheese. And hopefully those looking at this objectively would actually see that and acknowledge that. And our purpose, really, our objective, and Riaan alludes to purpose, it's a word that he uses often. I think that's the modern approach. People nowadays want to be assured that what they're doing has purpose. And the purpose really ultimately is to have reversed the impact of the environment in and around the Johannesburg area, now also in Carltonville area, where it's the issue of aquifers and tailings dams that have been built over dolomitic aquifers. It can play a big role. And 20, 30 years from now, when we reflect back on the career, then these are the things, hopefully, that we'll remember and that will stand us in good stead. So about 31 hectares of additional deposition facilities vegetated. There has been an increase in the amount of water that we're using in terms of potable water, but that is because of the addition of the new plant and the water usage there that's now being consolidated into our numbers. But we continue to look at reducing usage of externally sourced potable water. We don't want to compete with the communities and with other users of potable water. So recycled water is a big theme in our company, and we will continue to develop that theme. We're getting both treated AMD from TCTA, and we also have an arrangement for sewage, retreated sewage. We've got a lovely plant that treats sewage water, and we take most of the water that they treat. I think the big issue now, unfortunately, in Johannesburg is that not all the sewage reaches the sewage plant. So hopefully our partner there can lift its game, make sure that infrastructure actually delivers the sewage to the sewage plant, and then most of that water will find its way into our circuit, into the ergo circuit. And that too, I think, resonates both in terms of health and also the right sort of usage of the environment. And that was the fourth point that I was going to make in terms of how we impact the environment, is a slightly softer footprint, using less power through technologies that are conducive to that. Setting up the plant optimally in terms of our management systems to make sure that we don't overdraw power, and also in terms of water usage, making sure that our footprint is as light as it potentially could be.